The investigation into abuse at St. Michael's College School in Toronto is once again shining a spotlight on bad behavior by a few, sometimes prominent individuals. Attention began to focus on this issue when stories emerged about sexual misconduct by Donald Trump during his campaign to become U.S. president 2 years ago. I'm sure you remember those stories. And then allegations of sexual assault and rape against Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein. That spawned the Me Too movement. Earlier this year, comedian Bill Cosby was convicted of drugging and sexually assaulting Andrea Constand. And most recently, misconduct accusations arose during the confirmation hearings for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Well, some people call this a culture of aggression. Others call it toxic masculinity. We've assembled a panel to examine this topic, and we've got in studio here Una Grieve. She is an early childhood educator, a social worker, and a parent of 2 boys and also a daughter. Jonathan Reed at the far end is the program coordinator for Next Gen Men. That is an organization that empowers young men to think critically. And in the middle there is David O'Brien. He is a director of infant, child, and youth mental health at Yorktown Family Services, which is in Toronto. First off, I want to thank you all.
Thank you.
Do you find people are talking about this, Una, in your neighborhood, in your school environment?
Absolutely. I mean, the topic came up obviously when the St. Michael's incident happened. You know, for me, it was just horrific, but also that sense of I'm not surprised. And that's a sickening feeling to have that. It's definitely a topic of conversation, and one that we should be having. Jonathan, why should we be tackling this today in this age of zero tolerance? Why are we still talking about it?
Well, what I just thought of is that every single boys group that I've had since the St. Michael's College started, every single boy has talked about it. So the boys are talking about this as well, and I see this as an opportunity to really look at our culture of masculinity and how we're raising our boys and how boys are teaching each other these rules of manhood that they're growing into.
I want to get back into that because we're really talking about how does one get to be in the position of a protagonist, a bully, if you will. A sexual assaulter would be the criminal terminology, and those are some of the charges police are laying in the St. Mike's allegations. David, is there a key? Is there one thing we can point to that says this is the wrong path and this person will end up here?
There's multiple things. It's very complex, and that's an easy answer. But there's individual risk factors that lead someone to do this kind of action. There's societal factors. I mean, you started off the show today looking at our leaders in the world, and they've rose to power through bullying. So it's socially acceptable. If you come from a home where you don't have a lot of power and control and a lot of say in what goes on in that home, you need an outlet. And so this is what happens. And so it's a combination of societal factors, individual factors, and culture within environments, and cultures in our school that reinforce, cultures in community centers. So we have a big issue. That's not just about youth. That's actually bullying is across demographics, across ages.
When we use words like it's a societal issue, are we sort of taking the blame off individuals? I'm wondering about parents. You're a parent. You've got 2 boys. How much responsibility do you take for their actions further in life, and how much do you wear of that?
You know, I think that I am 100% responsible for my children's behavior up to a certain age. My job as a parent is to teach them good moral, ethical values, to learn them to trust, to talk, to communicate openly, to learn how to have positive relationships with the people that surround them. And then, you know, you grow these seeds, you give them water, sunshine, food, and teach them what we can as parents, and then we send them on their way to middle school, which is really the first time that they have that independence. And, you know, as a parent, I just want them to remember, you know, should I go to the ravine and smoke pot, or should I go home and do my studies, or, you know, go do something positive as a kid? So I think definitely there's a sense of responsibility for my child's behavior, but you know, you have to let it go eventually.
And when you do let it go and it goes the wrong way, what are the factors that help that person decide, I'm going to do A instead of B, Jonathan? I'm wondering about, once the parent lets go, when do the peers take over and the pressure of peers?
Yeah, I mean, boys are constantly teaching each other, and they're constantly constricting each other to some extent in terms of how they can behave and what choices they can make, because they're in this culture together. And I think that, sometimes they push each other into boxes, and it's not just it's not just boys teaching each other. They, like Dave said, they learn it from media, they learn it from parents and teachers, they learn it everywhere. But they find themselves pushed into boxes where the amount of choice that they have is quite limited.
Have we not gone beyond that, though, with our discussions of LGBTQ rights, with our discussions of transgender, our discussions of whether there should be labels on anybody? I don't know. Have we not left that in the dust?
Yeah, and that's a pretty normal instinct to have, and I think about that too as adults. But to be honest, I've heard from people that research adolescents that have said homophobia is growing as an issue, and so it's still present, absolutely, in school halls.
What do you hear from the boys you speak with about St. Mike's and about that peer pressure, if you will?
I'd say that what they're mostly talking about is kind of what I just talked about in terms of like the man box. Like they talk about fewer limits. Like yesterday with Next Gen Men, we were talking about would you stand up if a kid was getting bullied?
Interesting question.
Exactly. And having a conversation in which they were like, honestly, I don't know if I could put myself on the line like that. And so there's definitely kids that are talking about like, there's limits to like the amount of change that I can make in my own life.
Let's talk about bystanders, because that's an important part. When you have perhaps 1 or 2 or 3 perpetrators, but you have 40 or 45 or 50 bystanders. David, what creates that ability or the person to stand there and actually watch, in some cases video?
Good question. We don't talk about this enough. So the youth that we talk to at Yorktown talk about 2 things. Number 1 is that some youth are living vicariously through the bully. So there's some anger within that person. The other type of youth is actually pretty scared, because guess what? I don't want that being me. So I need to seem supportive to this perpetrator and the bully, because I don't want to be next. And that's where the culture comes in. So there's a culture amongst peers, right? That if I don't seem supportive to this situation, then I'm at risk. So I better somewhat seem supportive.
Is there a culpability in that? Is there, when you go home, is there guilt that you take with you? Does it haunt you?
Absolutely, and we don't focus enough on that, because today, I bet you there's youth, from this situation at St. Mike's feeling pretty guilty, which can lead to some depression, anxiety, shame, and often that can stick with these kids for a very long period of time.
These are allegations at this point, and police are investigating. But how does a bystander become a bully?
How does a bystander become a bully?
I mean, is that the natural progression?
Not necessarily, no, because I think there's in these gang mentality situations, there's 2 types of people. There's the perpetrators, who really are craving at any cost a sense of power and control, and even through antisocial means, and so bullying is an outlet for that. And there's the bystanders that I think are kind of in between, that, I need to belong to something or belong to someone, and perhaps they're not getting enough attention in their personal life, or they don't have family connections that nurture sort of positive growth, and so this becomes a bit of a pseudo family for them. So I need to be a part of something rather than part of nothing.
Let me ask you, Una, as a parent, do you want your children not to be bystanders, but is the alternative to be a hero? And do we tell our kids, don't be a hero, go tell someone? I'm wondering if we're sending mixed messages there.
Do I want my kid to be a hero? Yes, I think I do. I think, what happens in these situations is, I don't know any kid that doesn't want to belong. we all want to belong, whether we want to belong in our families, our culture, our church, our school, with our friends. And I think wanting to belong to, you just want your kid to belong to the right group. And it's tough. I do want my kid to be the hero, but I also want him or her to know that they have the resources of support at home and at school. When they do share, Mom, I saw this at school today, that they're not going to be feeling that they're next, or now I'm going to lose everything. And I think that kind of goes into the code of silence that Jonathan was talking about. Kids need to feel protected, and they need to be heard and listened to. And I think, there's that whole issue of trust. A kid feeling that he's been trusted or she's been trusted.
It's a great conversation. Are you glad we're having it? Is it about time? One of those, why didn't we do this decades ago?
It's about time, but it needs to continue. I mean, we have to be proactive.
All right, I want to thank you all. We're going to leave the conversation of this element, and I know we could talk for hours, and I wish we didn't have the beast of time, in which to work. But we'll take a break. Say goodbye to Una Grieve, early childhood educator, parent, who's brought us some of her thoughts. This part of it will turn our attention to solutions, remedies, if you will, how to make a cultural shift. And returning on set is child and youth therapist David O'Brien. We've also got Jonathan Reed. He is the program coordinator for Next Gen Men. And joining us, new to this session, but certainly not new to the program, is Glenn Canning. He is the father of Rehtaeh Parsons. He is also an advocate for sexual assault victims. So welcome to you, Glenn. Welcome back to you, David and Jonathan. Glenn, let me begin with you. People at home may need a reminder, but Rehtaeh killed herself, and she died. Well, she tried to commit suicide. She died in hospital, but there were allegations of sexual assault. There were videos that were posted that shamed her. In your discussions with young people, how do you advocate for changing the world?
I basically, I think sometimes when I go into high schools or something like that, it comes across to young people as an awful, sad story. And for them to see a parent who's kind of broken up and sad and upset by something like this, it resonates with them in some way. So I just don't try to go in with tears or anything like that, but I go in with a story that could have been prevented, and I give examples of people who tried to stand up for Rehtaeh. And how thankful I am to them. I try to give examples of what's going on in the world today, what's going on in their lives, and I highlight the dangers of social media and stuff like that. But really what I try to do is I try to say, you don't try to be that person who would be in a room with somebody and would say this just can't happen. And I have
a sign in one of the rooms at my house that says, try to be the person your dog thinks you are.
Yeah. Exactly.
Because they think you're fantastic.
Yeah.
Why can't we all be those people?
Yeah.
Jonathan, you deal with young men and you also have a podcast that I'd like you to share some of that with us later. But when people come to you with questions, what should I do when I see this? Or this is happening to me, I'm being bullied, I'm being assaulted, or in worst case scenario, I'm being sexually assaulted. And then how do you tackle that in terms of a solution?
What I was just thinking about is that I feel like we do talk about bullying a lot with kids. A lot, like every kid knows about bullying, and I don't think that we do enough conversation. We have enough conversation about, at least for boys, like about masculinity and about what some people would call toxic masculinity. So when we're talking about like this happened to me, I think it's really important to have a conversation about. What does the culture look like that this boy is experiencing?
Absolutely.
And why so?
It's important because there's individual factors, but there's also a culture that reinforces that and then allows that. In the case of sort of gang mentality bullying, if youth don't feel like there's an outlet to approach an adult for support, or if they approach an adult that there'll be repercussions from the bully, no one's going to come forward. So we need to create environments and institutions and structures that make it safe for people to come forward. And I know that's a cliche, but we really have to do that because It's the culture that feeds into this.
So how important then, in the case that you have had to deal with and the stories that you share with students, Glenn, to have had that in place, would it have affected change?
I believe absolutely. If we had, I think a lot of stuff that happened with Rete, and I do think some of the information that's coming out from St. Michael's, it falls on adults. You know, we can say, you know, that we got to get kids to stand up and do things, and that's so important. But at the same time, you know, they have to have faith in the adults around them. And I know in Rete's case, you know, there were students who came forward and said, you know, this boy has that picture, he's sharing it, and teachers just said to them, we're not allowed to discuss that here in school. So what was the point of it? And that's just something we need to change. Young people have to know that I can speak up about something, I will be safe if I speak up about something, and I'll be believed if I speak up. And not only that, but there will be an adult there who's going to listen and is going to do something.
I'll jump in and say something about that, which is that I'm thinking about a transgender boy that I know who's on the podcast, and he talked about bullying that he experienced and physical bullying and what would be called, I guess, sexual assault. And it was on a bus, on a school bus. And one of the most heartbreaking parts of his story was that he said the bus driver saw it. The bus driver didn't say anything, and a teacher found out, and the teacher talked to the kids, and he said he didn't stop. And so again, I agree. Like, it falls down to how these teachers and the mentors and educators responding to boys and helping them uplift a more positive culture.
So is it a training that we need to put in place? Is there? I'm thinking about the shift in mentality when it comes to drinking and driving. You know, we've all heard of MAD, right? Mothers Against Drunk Driving. That shift in mentality happened. It happened over time, but who do you know now that drinks and drives? I don't know anybody because it's just dumb. So how do we change the mentality when it comes to bullying being just dumb?
Yes, so Matt, a fantastic way they did things, and they focused on individual factors, but they also focused on institutional factors and changing structures and making it socially irresponsible and unacceptable to drink by you know, tackling things at individual levels, at sort of macro levels, and within context of you know, of environments, right? And so the same thing for bullying is that we need to work with youth on an individual level to give them an opportunity to have a sense of control and power in a positive way. In environments, we have to engage youth and be a part of the solutions, and engage youth in creating programs, engage youth in creating rules for schools. And as a parent, being involved, right? Being involved within the school culture.
So it's not just coming from the top down,
That's
but there's this whole community, holistic approach, if you will.
And we got to stop voting in people who bully their way into power.
You know, I got an email from one of our viewers who had heard that we were going to have this panel discussion today, who said, you know, the people who make it, who are in power in many instances, powerful corporations, powerful political offices, and I'm not going to mention any names of anyone. People at home will have their own names come to mind, but maybe that is one of the perks of being a bully, that you end up in these positions of power because you are an aggressive personality. I think that's a whole other conversation, and I don't want to digress. I do want to ask you this one question about the wording that we use. We've been talking about bullying. Bullying to me sounds kind of lame. Should we be calling it sexual assault? Should we be calling it a crime?
Yeah, I think when we use the word bullying, I think a lot of adults look at it and go, it's just bullying. Everybody had bullying in school, and then they can dismiss it.
I was bullied in school. You probably were.
Right,
I mean, we all were at some point.
When we started talking about what happened in St. Michael's, this is sexual assault.
Sexual violence.
You know, that's sexual violence. That entire conversation changed right away.
Yeah. And those are allegations of sexual violence.
Sure,
I don't want to say, you know, but is that important, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, changing the language lets you talk about, like, when you bring stories and you bring real consequences. Like, I know a boy who's been expelled basically because he was getting bullied and he would try to stand up for himself in a physical way. And I know that multiple kids that I can think of who were bullied. A 9-year-old in Denver this past fall killed himself because he was bullied for being gay. When you can bring stories that show, like, where does this culture take us? And if bullying is just one piece, right, of what you could call patriarchy, what you could call masculinity or toxic masculinity, like, if bullying is a piece of that, like, where does that take us? You know, and there are real serious consequences for kids and for people as they grow up.
So what are we not doing that we need to be doing? Let me just end with that question.
Sure. I think what we need to do is we have a lot of sports in school for young men, and, you know, we have a lot of academic programs, stuff like that. We need to have more programs that teach young people about social justice issues, and empathy, how to stand up for things. You know, here's what's going on in our community. What would you do? Should we do? What as a school can we do to help this out? And I think we start teaching programs like that, we're going to start getting young people more involved, and then young people will know, you know, it's my duty to my community and to my school and to my family to stand up, to speak up, and to be there for people who need someone to be there for them.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that and say that specifically programs that address masculinity and give boys a safe place to talk about their identity, to talk about their culture. One of the things that different programs that I've seen in Next Gen Men, but we've seen in other programs as well, is young boys, like pre-adolescent, adolescent boys, then take that learning opportunity and turn it into their own leadership. So there's like, I can think of grade 7 boys that are helping grade 2 boys feel more confident in themselves and protect themselves and help each other feel safe. So it turns boys into leaders.
And when you speak about grade 2, we're talking about 7-year-olds. Is it ever too early to start opening up that discussion of the masculinity box?
I don't think it's ever too early, but I think what's really important is that 12-year-olds teaching 7-year-olds with the guidance of educated, experienced mentors. That's a really powerful thing.
Yes, because you can't just leave them on their own without the tools in their toolbox, right? And that comes from guidance. David?
Adults have to be a part of the solution. Adults need to be engaged. Adults need to co-develop plans with youth. So when a youth comes forward, it's not a panic and I'm going to call the police. It's how are we going to co-develop a plan together? Because more and more youth will come forward when they have a voice within that plan. And that will change culture.
And the earlier they do come forward, the better the resolution.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I do want to ask you one thing, Glenn, just as an aside. You know, your daughter died so many years ago, and people talk about closure. I'm wondering if this would help in the closure process if we can change the world and our culture of aggression.
Yeah, I've been a part of a great group of young guys in Ottawa, the Man Up program in Ottawa high schools, and they took Ritea's story. It literally started from them listening to Ritea's story and asking themselves, what can we do about this so it doesn't happen in our school? And I'll tell you that brings me a lot of pride, and it also brings me a lot of healing to know that you know, Ritea's life and her death has brought about some change, and it's brought about a lot of good things for a lot of people.
I want to thank you all for your ideas, your stories, and I appreciate you getting this conversation going. And I know you'll take it forward. You absolutely will. But thank you to our guests. Glenn Canning is here, of course, Jonathan Reed and David O'Brien. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Hannah.